Dr. Hall, okay, so Dr. Hall, can you tell us the steps involved in conducting a piece of research using quantitative methods, a sort of procedural template?
Yeah, I think I'll use more of an example-based approach, if that's
Sure, sure,
okay.
yeah, fine.
Um, we conducted a fairly large randomized trial study in Belize. We had, I would say, over 3,000 children involved in the study. Um, we were asked to look at a particular program that was being implemented in the schools called, it was a curriculum called Positive Action. And we wanted to know whether it was having effect on the social emotional learning of young children in primary grades. So um, we opted to implement a randomized trial design. It was actually a cluster randomized trial, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But the idea the idea of a randomized trial allows you to take this very well-developed intervention and determine what kind of an effect it's having on the children because you have a treatment group and a control group, much like you would have in any medical study that you would conduct with a drug. We randomly assign the drug to some study participants. The other study participants don't get anything. And you see what the progress is with the ones who receive the intervention. In doing school-based kinds of studies like this, it takes some time, though, typically a lot longer than it might take for a medical study. So we planned the study to last for an entire school year. And when I'm brought in, the first thing I began to do with people from the Ministry of Education, the officials, is I make sure they're okay and they understand that we're going to randomly assign people to get the intervention and those not. Because one of the biggest problems we run into in social sciences when we do a randomized trial study like this is that people get very concerned that some study participants are not getting the intervention. And that this becomes a big concern. You end up with people saying, well, why can't my child or why can't these children have the intervention? And the reason is because we don't know yet if it works. Doing this research is a process of trying to figure out if it actually works.
All right, can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
Because we talked about how do you choose your design before. And I'm saying, why don't we do a pre-test, post-test thing? So everybody can, what are your scores pre-test, what are your scores post-test? How do you come up with a study where you decide that half have and half don't versus a study where you decide that everybody does and everybody doesn't?
It's a good question. Pre-test, post-test studies don't really allow you to establish the causality of the intervention.
Okay.
In other words, everybody's going to progress at some level.
Okay.
And you really don't know how much they would progress without the curriculum. So if you give the curriculum to every child in the school and they progress at some rate, how do you know how they would have progressed in the absence of having that curriculum?
True. Okay.
Okay, so that's why we randomly assign some to receive the curriculum and others not. And you measure the pre-post differences in the two groups, and you can see then the differences that may occur between the two different
And
groups.
well, I was about to say you blame the intervention, but you credit the intervention, hopefully.
You can blame or credit the intervention. It depends. Sometimes these and I have a recent study that we conducted in Barbados, and the intervention on some outcomes the effect was negative. So there are times when they don't, not only do they not work, they work in the opposite direction. So it's another good reason not to give the intervention to everyone until you've had a chance to test it with a research study.
Okay.
So when we do these kinds of studies, I think the first thing is to check and make sure everybody's aware of what you're about to do. If you're going to, and I typically try to conduct a randomized trial study at the outset. Sometimes that's not possible. I've had instances where we've looked at, for example, the career advancement program here in the Ministry of Education in Jamaica, and it wasn't possible. And it took us meeting with the stakeholders in the ministry for approximately a week before we could come to agreement on a kind of design that would be suitable for examining the program.
Okay.
But I typically start with trying to do a randomized trial first. If that won't work and I'm not allowed to randomly assign participants to treatment and control groups, which is essential to do a randomized trial, then you back off and you do a quasi-experimental trial, for example. If individuals have been already assigned which in that case they had been already assigned to the treatment group and the comparison group, then you're in a situation where you can use some statistical procedures to match some of the participants so that you can get a sense of you're essentially creating a randomized trial with a statistical approach to create your two groups.
So you try to eliminate as many of the differences as possible, so that the only difference was that they had the intervention or not.
Exactly. You try to isolate that one independent variable as the only thing that could cause the effects that you observe.
Okay.
So the second step is, once you kind of get a sense of, this is what we're going to do with our design, what are the dependent variables that need to be measured? And in a lot of instances, you have a variety, and I would recommend, if you're going to go to the trouble of conducting one of these kinds of studies, try to include as many different kinds of dependent variables as you think are worthwhile to observe. Because it's a lot of effort to do one of these, right? And so you want to collect data on what I refer to as proximal versus distal outcomes, or dependent variables in your studies. There are variables that are very closely, you might try to assess, like for example in this positive action curriculum program, we had assessments that were directly tied to the curriculum, and those were very proximal measures of whether or not the program was having effect. But we also had measures of academic outcomes, which were not necessarily directly tied to the curriculum, but we wanted to see if those also changed as a consequence of the kids being exposed to the treatment. And so that gave us a more distal measure. And then you could look at all kinds of things in between, or even farther distal to the program, to see what kind of effects it has. And you would typically, we talk about effect sizes in research, and you would typically expect smaller effect sizes on those distal outcome measures than you would on the proximal measures. But that gets back to construct validity and making sure that the measures that you use are well developed, and they're measuring the kinds of things that you think are important and are linked to this intervention. And then the other thing becomes then the practical matter of putting the study in place on the ground in the field. And that typically involves a number of working parts. One is the study participants and getting them recruited to the study. You've got to go through all the ethical approvals, of course, before you begin conducting your study. But then making sure they're all informed, that you have informed consent, and then training individuals to actually go into the field to administer the measures when it's time to do it, identifying when the right times are to do it, and whether or not you want to have a longitudinal component to your study to see what change looks like maybe at multiple points over time for both of the groups. Or maybe there's more than two groups. Maybe you have different levels of the intervention that you're measuring. So it's important to think through, okay, what's the timing of these things? How am I going to get people in the field that are able to administer these measures and administer them in the same way, because that'll have an effect on the reliability of the measures if they're administered in different ways. So you're just trying to make sure you've got all of these bases covered, right? And so it involves doing some serious training with the people that are on your staff for the research study. Then how do they actually code the data and put the data in? So you got to think through that, creating a code book so that everybody understands how to score the measures exactly, and record the data. And I try to make it as simple as possible. It can get complicated very quickly, so always focusing on trying to keep things simple for everyone so that everybody can follow the same procedures. It seems to be pretty helpful. And then once you finally get your data collected, then there's a whole process of going through and cleaning the data. I typically use a technique where we have all of my data entry people enter the data. They work in pairs, where one person enters the data, they pass it off to somebody else, and they enter the data, and then you match up the two data entries to see if there are any discrepant entries. And that will help you get a cleaner set of data at the end of the day. So that's important.
So they do that simultaneously? It's not a case that I finish mine and then give it to somebody else?
Yeah, you would finish it and then pass it off to somebody else, and they do it separately.
Okay.
And then I take the two Excel files where
Okay.
the data has been entered, and I match them up. And I can see where some of the cells maybe you have different values from the two different data entries. And then someone like myself goes back and looks at the original form to correct what that entry should be so that we have the correct values.
Why aren't you doing it that I finish mine and I hand over the forms and my Excel file and somebody else just goes through the forms and checking mine? Why do they produce a second document? Because that leaves open more errors.
Well,
I think.
It won't leave open more errors. What will happen is if you have two separate data entries, you can merge them together and see just what the entry errors were from both of the separate entries to correct them. If I pass off an already completed Excel file to someone else and they just check it, they won't know what to check.
Even if I'm giving them the forms?
Well, you can give them the forms and they can go through it, but there's a likelihood that
They'll make the same errors that I made?
the same errors. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're trying to avoid some of those same data entry errors. At that point, there are statistical assumptions that we check, assumptions about normality and the distributions of the variables and such. How much of the data is missing, because you almost always have missingness in the data.
I know.
And once you've verified those assumptions and done things to correct for any distributional problems in the data, then it's a matter of conducting analysis, which is frequently one of the shortest processes in the whole study.
You make sure you know your techniques.
Yeah, but they don't take long to. The computers are fast these days. They run the statistical analyses very quickly.
But at least you have to know which ones to plug in, eh?
You do, and you want to be principled about it, and so that you're following through and just in doing the investigations with the hypotheses and research questions that you stated at the outset of the study.
Okay, so that's it. And then you write up your study,
And then,
you come up with any recommendations you have,
Exactly.
and you tell the government what it should be doing.
Yes, the interpretive work then takes place as to what all this means, and that can take some time, because it takes time to think about what do these findings mean, especially if you get a mixed bag of things. You know, you ask yourself questions as to why I'm getting things that I didn't anticipate. You want to be able to answer those questions as well.
True, and the context in which you find yourself. So you could have a finding, but here in Jamaica it means a different thing from Texas, you know? The
Exactly.
same finding might mean something totally different.
Yeah, it could. It could, yeah.
All right. Okay, so thanks, Doc.
You're
That was nice. I liked that, the case approach.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So thanks.
Uh-huh.